Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlicker shills, Nestle, search, peasants, vassals, Aussies, crikey. I'm a useful idiot. Today we're going to talk about Australia, as long as we're talking about broke-ass countries. And it turns out Australia is now about to taste the aftermath of a housing bubble, because they have one going on right now. And one of the first clues that we have that there's a housing bubble in Australia is the fact that the head of the Central Bank of Australia says there isn't a housing bubble, and that's usually your first clue that there is one and that it's really bad. And housing has kind of had the same trajectory in Australia that it's had in the United States and most of the world, as it turns out, becoming more and more unaffordable. In fact, from the 90s up until recently, Australian housing went up 200 to 300%. And just like our housing industry in the United States and our mortgage industry, as it turns out, the entire industry was rampant with fraud. This is a point I like to bring up over and over again because a lot of conservatives like to blame the Bill Clinton and the Community Reinvestment Act for opening the floodgates and getting all these people into loans they couldn't afford, and that's what caused the housing collapse, which is really a small portion of it. In fact, it's negligible. When you look at the details, it really had little to do with it. So I always like to bring up this opportunity to dispel that myth by pointing out the fact that there was a housing bubble all over the globe. It had to do with speculation. It had to do with poor underwriting in order to bundle securities and mass speculation and driving those prices up. Most importantly, an entire industry from top to bottom riddled with fraud and corruption. So that is what happened, and it happened globally. So let's remember that. So let's get back to what's going on there in Australia right now. And so we have all the earmarkings of a collapse going on in Australia. They have a speculative housing bubble that's bursting. They have a welfare state that they can't control. And then they are starting to have massive amount of debts, and the banks' bad assets are piling up, and will continue to pile up as their housing bubble bursts. And they have a huge unemployment problem, 25% among their youth. So we're seeing this same pattern play out over and over again. So we know exactly what to look for in Australia and what to expect next. And a lot of this was caused by the fact that the slowdown in China is really having a huge effect on Australia, because their economy was driven by a commodities export boom to China, which is certainly slowed down, to say the least. And now all these problems in the Australian economy and bank system are showing up. And that's how it works. Everything looks fine, and they can all lie about how great they're doing. Everything's pumping along, and all the wealthy extract all the wealth out of the economy. But once things sour a little bit, it doesn't take long to expose all the dirty laundry. And that's happened worldwide. Now we're seeing that in Australia. They look like an economic powerhouse, and now their dirty laundry is being aired for everyone to see. And so this housing bubble, American bankers who've had a little experience in this area are saying that their housing prices could plummet as much as 60%. And that's how much their inflation has kicked in their housing market. And land investments were even more speculative, so their prices may plummet 80 to 90%, and then commercial real estate may drop by as much as 50% too. That makes sense when you look at the numbers for the industry in Australia. Corporate failures are rising. They're up 13.4% just last year. 6,000 corporations failed in Australia. The economy was in a contraction all of last year. Retail sales are collapsing. And a dramatic rise in small business failures, too. 50% increase over the last 3 years, and a 95% decrease in startups. So that means not only are small businesses failing at a high level, but no new small businesses are rising to take their place. So that explains why there would be a commercial real estate drop in Australia, unless they did what they did in the U.S., because we would, with all the retail businesses shuttering all across the United States, we would have had a commercial real estate collapse, except for the government and the Treasury stepped in and allowed commercial real estate to have their debts rolled over for an extended period. So anyway, that's why there was no commercial real estate collapse in the United States thus far. But it looks like they're set for one in Australia. And so there's a potential for a huge crash in their prices. And, of course, this will be reflected in their market as well. And their banks holding massive bad assets. So their banking system is probably going to collapse. But they're well on their way, even before this banking collapse. Their 2004 poverty rate, people living below the poverty rate, was 9.9% in 2004. In 2006, it was 11.1%, and last year it was 12.8% living below the poverty line. So that's 20% of a population of 23 million, and so that's pretty grim. Well, like I say, they have a youth unemployment of 25%, which is also very grim, and public debt of $400 billion. Because just like in the United States, the real wages have been declining. So credit and borrowing and household debt has been skyrocketing, and so that will only add to the burden when everything finally collapses. And income inequality has also been increasing. So this is the same thing we see around the globe, particularly in the United States as well. We have the welfare state being taxed to the limits. We have people falling into poverty, but the people at the top are doing great. And people in the government are doing great. So here's another thing they have in common with the rest of the world, besides overtaxed, unfunded liability like their Social Security system, and speculative bubbles like real estate blowing up, their economy in contraction, people falling into poverty, income inequality increasing. At the same time, the federal government is exploding in size. It rose, the federal payroll in Australia rose from 32% from 2008 to 2012. So when the economic collapse hit the United States, the Australian government went on a hiring binge, and 32% in 4 years. That's pretty mind-boggling. So their government payroll went from $18 billion to $24 billion in a matter of 4 years. So they're all loaded up now with debt, right when they can least afford it. And another interesting thing that happened in Australia is we hear all about Cyprus and confiscation of deposits there, but it turns out in Australia, Social Security system there is broke, and the government levied a 15% tax on retirement earnings over $100,000. Well, you can call that a tax if you want, but it sounds like the government basically confiscated 15% of all retirement deposits over $100,000, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong on that. So there's a pretty startling thing. It's like I said in the video about Cyprus. That was not really a template, because the template had already been set. Cyprus is just utilizing confiscation of people's accounts. This same mechanism has been used and written into bailouts all over the world, just using different mechanisms and different language. And but I'm not the only one to call it out. Tony Abbott, the leader of the opposition in Australia, said that, quote, the government was raiding people's retirement savings to fund its own excessive spending, unquote. Boy, does that sound familiar. So Australia joins the club. And turns out, too, that not only does the federal government expanded and the payroll rose in Australia, but they're very top-heavy. They have one manager for every 2.5 employees in the Australian public service. 45,000, or 29% of all Australian public workers, are listed as executives. So talk about a top-heavy, useless bureaucracy. They've got plenty of it. And as usual, public sector wages are 23% higher, and then they have tons of pension liabilities. So here we go again. Australia has all the makings of a classic collapse, and it has every single detail that we've seen in the Eurozone countries, and every single detail that we've seen in the United States. And their pain is coming. So you'll be reading a lot more about them soon. This collapse will happen, and the global contraction will continue in these feedback loops. Now we'll have Australia out of the import-export loop, and the Chinese slow down, and all these things will just feed off each other driving this depression further. And Australia will join the club. So there you have it. Australia, another country with its head on the chopping block. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.